I'm JG Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, I'd like to remind you that I am currently without any advertisers or sponsors. So, that means you, the listener, are going to be key in helping to keep this show going and growing. You can do that by donating to my Patreon page at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. With that out of the way, I had a rather interesting and important conversation with Annelle Sheline last week, and I'm releasing it now. Annelle, for those that don't know, is a multi-time guest on the program and a former Biden-era State Department official who resigned over the Biden administration's handling of Gaza. She now is back at the Quincy Institute and joined me to discuss President Donald Trump's recent comments about wanting to clean out Gaza. We're going to talk about what that would mean, the implications of that, and much more in the conversation to follow. So with that being said, let's get right to it with Annelle Sheline. Welcome back to Parallax Views. One of my favorite guests, Dr. Annelle Sheline, is at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. She was formerly at the State Department, where she resigned over the Biden administration's handling of Gaza. And we're going to be talking about Trump's recent, very concerning statements about what he wants to do in Gaza. First off, how are you doing, Annelle?
Doing well. Thanks for having me back.
So, unless my listeners have been living under a rock when it comes to this latest Gaza news, Trump has basically said he wants to clean out Gaza. He said this on Air Force One to a number of reporters. Maybe you could fill us in on what exactly he said and what this entails.
Yeah, so these were very concerning comments. You and I are speaking on Wednesday, January 29th, and I believe he made these comments on Monday, so just 2 days ago. And as you said, he said that he wants to clean out Gaza, just clean it out. These comments seem to have perhaps been made off the cuff. It's unclear to what extent he's aware of the implications of what that would mean. Also, the extent to which this is already something that has been sort of discussed or suggested in the past. I mean, we know that early on, after October 7th, members of Congress had sort of floated this idea. And at the time, Egypt and Jordan pushed back extremely forcefully. I mean, this has long been an extreme red line for them. And just in case anyone has questions about that, I mean, so it's not only that if other countries, so it's sort of stepping aside from just the fact that the question isn't why don't the Palestinians leave, it's why is Israel allowed to continue to engage in such horrific violence against them that Gaza is so destroyed that it's uninhabitable. I mean, it's sort of floated as this humanitarian solution, but the real question should be, well, why are they in these circumstances in the first place? Why isn't that the issue that countries are working together to make sure that Israel is no longer allowed to do such things? Um, so fundamentally, this would be a crime against humanity. I mean, this would be ethnic cleansing. Um, this would break all kinds of international laws. In addition, this would be extremely politically unpopular across the Arab world. It doesn't matter if it were Egypt or Jordan, Lebanon. I saw a version of a plan that suggested sending Palestinians to Iraq and Yemen. Um, in none of these countries would the existing population support this because this would be undermining the cause of the Palestinians, and it would be seen as these leaders being complicit in siding with Israel over the Palestinians. You've already seen a certain amount of pushback when countries signed on to the Abraham Accords, because that was also seen as siding with Israel against the Palestinians. So you've seen massive protests in Morocco, for example, against the fact that Morocco in 2020 did join the Abraham Accords and normalized with Israel. That's not so out of keeping with the Moroccan government, which has long had a close relationship with Israel, and we can talk more about that. Whereas in the UAE, they have such a small population of Emiratis, it wasn't really that much of a concern. Um, in Bahrain, I mean, similarly, it's so authoritarian, as people may recall from the Arab Spring, any sort of the popular resistance to the Bahraini royals was crushed when the Saudis invaded and killed a lot of people. Anyway, but all that to say, so this would not only be extremely delegitimizing for any of these rulers if they were to agree to take large numbers of Palestinians, but in certain countries, especially like Jordan, this would just be hugely destabilizing from a demographic perspective. I mean, Jordan is already approximately half the population is of Palestinian origin as a result of 1948 and 1967 and subsequent expulsions of Palestinians from historic Palestine. Um, Furthermore, the 1994 Israel-Jordan peace treaty specifies that Israel is not allowed to displace Palestinians into Jordan. And then this goes back to this sort of historical notion. Israel had tried to advocate for the idea that Jordan could be the alternative homeland for the Palestinians. And what's interesting is, initially the Hashemites that ruled Jordan were, they maintain custodianship of the Muslim and Christian holy sites in Jerusalem, for example. And for a long time, they saw, themselves as sort of the rightful rulers, or, the Hashemites have a very long history. They're descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. They were originally based in the Hejaz and controlled the holy cities of Mecca and Medina and what is now Saudi Arabia, and were pushed out by the Al Saud over 100 years ago. Um, so, this question of could Jordan be Palestine, Jordan tried to really definitively say no, Jordan is Jordan and Palestine is Palestine. And this is a key component of the peace treaty. Um, and so when I was
So
in
this would jeopardize that treaty. Yeah.
this would tear apart the treaty. I mean, this is this is a key
Right. I'm,
component.
I'm not even going far enough in some ways.
Right. And this was a huge thing when I was in Jordan, a few months ago, before Trump had been elected, when there was just this concern that Jordanians felt they no longer had a partner in Israel. I mean, obviously, for the average Jordanian, Israel remains, the treaty remains extremely unpopular. But for the Jordanian government, they have benefited significantly from the treaty, partly because the United States, I believe about 10% of Jordan's budget comes from the United States just sending aid. Much of it is military aid, but there's also some economic aid. Um, so if this were to happen, again, if either Trump were to greenlight Palestinians being cleansed from Gaza and sent to Jordan, or in many ways, what, at least when I was there, Jordanians were afraid of was the annexation of the West Bank and Israel pushing Palestinians from the West Bank into Jordan, just sort of across what is a very long border. Israel's longest border is the one it shares with Jordan. Um, that this would be so destabilizing. This could overturn Abdullah's government, the because he would be forced to either respond to the violation of the treaty, which would then jeopardize the money he gets from the United States, which could be quite destabilizing, or he would have to just take it, just accept what Israel was doing, and likely then be brought down, that because half of his population is Palestinian, and he would also then be dealing with however many hundreds of thousands or a million plus. There are 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank, so it's just a question of how many might be forced across the border. And you think about the destabilization this country has experienced politically as a result of what in terms of like the proportion to the US population, the number of migrants that have come across the border. I know it's described as a crisis, and it was higher than what was seen previously, but it's so small compared to what proportionally it would be in terms of the existing population of Jordan to then have some large number of Palestinians added to it. It's unlikely that the Jordanian government could survive. And so the reason I say all this is because I think, when Trump was saying this, I don't know that he was fully aware of not only that this was tried in the past, because in the context of the Nakba in 1948, when Israel was established, 750,000 Palestinians were already displaced, and many of them went to Jordan. This is why half the population of Jordan is Palestinian, but also to Lebanon, also to Syria. And then you saw in the subsequent decades efforts by Palestinian groups to resist, to push back. In Jordan, in 1970, you had a series of events that are referred to as Black September, where the PLO it was essentially a civil war. It was kind of the PLO and Palestinians trying to take over the government, basically, or doing what they could to try to push Jordan in a different direction. And so King Hussein, who the father of the current King Abdullah, expelled the PLO from Jordan. They went to Lebanon, and I mean, at that moment, it could have taken down the government of Jordan. Many, an analysis of that time just emphasizes King Hussein's luck with the fact that he was able to hang on to control. And so this idea that you could just displace millions of Palestinians and send a million here, another million, a million to Egypt, a million to Jordan, maybe a million to Lebanon or something. It's like, well, then you've just sort of expanded the problem from Israel's perspective. And now you have large numbers of Palestinians extremely angry and trying to engage in the same kinds of actions that made Israel feel so insecure, for the past so ever many decades. Um, so, I wouldn't, I hope that Trump's team is walking him through what it would actually mean for millions of Palestinians to be displaced around the region.
So how have, the leaders of Jordan and Egypt responded to this, Abdullah and Al-Sisi?
Um, so Egypt and Jordan had already made clear prior to this that this was a red line. Ayman al-Safadi, who's the foreign minister of Jordan, who has been extremely outspoken about this, about Gaza, about Israel's war. He's spoken in stronger terms than we're probably used to hearing from Jordan, and in part because this is such a salient issue for Jordanians, whether they're of Palestinian descent or Jordanian descent. This is part of what's interesting, because that sort of divide has long been sort of a crucial way that the government of Jordan has tried to sort of manage the population is that people of Palestinian origin tended to be more in kind of the private sector, whereas kind of the Jordanians and the tribal peoples who have been there for generations, they tended to make up more of the public sector and especially the military. And so this was a cleavage that the government could sort of manipulate to its own benefit. And what's been so interesting in the context of Gaza has been the way that that cleavage has somewhat broken down in just the magnitude of support for Palestinians and to try to resist what Israel has been doing to Gaza. Um, as far as how how these two leaders have reacted to these comments, I haven't seen. That's a good question. I know that Trump said he'd already spoken with Abdullah and was scheduled to speak with Sisi. We know that Trump froze all foreign assistance except to Israel and Egypt, interestingly. And so I think clearly he's trying to demonstrate to Jordan that they just have to do what he says. But again, I just hope that someone in the White House is trying to explain to him what it would mean if that were in fact to be something that they wanted to pursue.
How would this, I have to ask this, how would this affect Israel if it were carried out? Would this even be bad for Israel itself?
I mean, again, it sort of puts Israel back in the position that it was in for the first few decades of its existence, where it had displaced so many Palestinians into sort of the neighboring countries. And then, you think about like like the origins of Hezbollah, for example. And I mean that was directly tied to like Israel's invasion and occupation of southern Lebanon, but also large numbers of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. Um, like I said, the PLO almost taking over, taking control of Jordan. It does not. And although I think, unfortunately, um, historically inside Israel, I do think that Israeli leaders, had a little bit more of an attitude of compromise, things like you think about the fact that Israel was willing to give back the Sinai to Egypt in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, and then with Egypt, Anwar Sadat being willing to sign the peace treaty in 1979. But that did involve some compromise. And I think that some of these earlier Israeli leaders, in the aftermath of sort of establishing this new state, were more willing to compromise, in part because they couldn't count on such unconditional, massive support from a superpower like the United States. Whereas in recent decades, you've had so much support from the US that not only has it sort of shifted Israel's thinking on this, it's, you know, the the people that are kind of many people who are opposed to what Israel has become are leaving Israel, and those that are left tend to be they're more likely to be more religious. They're likely to embrace extremism. They're not all
Sort
settlers,
of
but
far right wing nationalism.
exactly.
Yeah.
And this is, and you see this reflected in the electoral outcomes, unfortunately. And so this just goes back to the ways that this extreme level of US support creates a moral hazard. So for Israel, but also arguably for other countries, if the US were to give an open-ended security commitment to the Saudis, for example, we could see similarly maximalist, aggressive behavior from Saudi Arabia. Um, so, in general, I don't think it's in Israel's interest long term to continue to behave as a rogue state. At the end of the day, who knows how long it'll happen, but at some point, the US is no longer going to be able to sort of throw around its power the way it does now. I mean, who knows how long that'll take, but eventually Israel is going to need to sort of coexist with its neighbors. And so I think previous Israeli leaders were a little bit more willing to behave, in a more neighborly fashion. Whereas now especially ministers like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are obviously proponents of this idea of Greater Israel, wanting to take the West Bank, I mean, the notion of Greater Israel includes, portions of Egypt and Lebanon. Like it's bigger than just the West Bank. Um, And I think because they've gotten such unconditional support from Biden and now from Trump, although again, it's like Trump did get the ceasefire through, but also what did he promise in exchange? And like, what is, these kinds of comments about ethnically cleansing Palestinians certainly don't bode well for sort of an outcome that would actually resolve the conflict.
Yeah, and that is the kicker here. I mean, he's openly calling for an ethnic cleansing. I think people really need to understand that. Yeah.
Right, right. And and obviously, international law has not constrained Israel's treatment or the America's treatment of Palestinians or many other people, to be clear, in the past. But again, it's sort of like, well, in terms of Israel's long-term security, it I know this isn't the outcome, but I think I initially had some hope that perhaps one of the takeaways from October 7th would be we can't continue to marginalize the Palestinians. We have to, like, so the only path to security lies in some kind of solution that provides security and justice for both sides. Obviously, that is not what came out of this. Um, but I hope that in the longer term, there may be some greater recognition of that. But again, I think that kind of mindset would only be possible if the U.S. stopped providing such unconditional support, which again just incentivizes the kinds of aggression that we've seen.
It's interesting. I have an article up from France 24, the French news publication, and they note that France and Germany have called this idea unacceptable. Spain's foreign minister said that Madrid's position was clear. Gazans need to stay in Gaza. It seems like even Europe is put off by this call that Trump made. And the thing is, it's hard to tell where exactly this will go because I don't know when Trump is just blowing, smoke and when he's, really set on doing something.
Right. And I clearly, with everything he's been doing, he made a comment about, well, allegedly, I don't know that that's been backed up, but Israeli media was reporting that he made a comment about getting American troops out of Syria. And it's sort of like, was he serious about that? Was that a trial balloon? Um, and the to go back to his comment of just cleaning out Gaza. I mean, I've gotten this question from when I'm speaking about these subjects of people saying, well, why don't other countries just take them? Like in the context of the genocide, why aren't other countries just allowing them to get out of Israel's way? And and again, it's sort of like, well, why should it be on other countries? Like Israel should just stop. Like why is Israel allowed to just engage in a genocide? Um, and then I would try to answer it by saying also just in the context of this would be political suicide for any Arab leader, and the question of the national sovereignty of Palestinians. And obviously, if anyone were to leave, Israel would never allow them back. Although it has been interesting to see people returning to North Gaza, because I think for so many Palestinians, they thought they would never even get to go back
Yeah,
to
it's
North Gaza.
thousands are returning right now.
Right,
So yeah.
hundreds of thousands. Um, and, I think for so many Palestinians for whom it is such a trauma to have been expelled from their homes in 1948 or other subsequent expulsions, even, ongoing in the West Bank right now, um, to then be able to actually go back to one's home or to the rubble of one's home, but at least back to this place, is the realization of a dream for so many Palestinians, and for the vast majority of Palestinians, it would mean going back to a home in what is now Israel. The that Israel has worked very hard to make sure that that dream never becomes a reality.
Before we close out, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on. I know we have Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff going to visit Israel, and I believe he's going to be visiting Gaza too.
That was misleading because the Washington Post reported on this that like he's going to visit Gaza, and I was like, wow. But no, he's just going with the IDF to the Philadelphia and Netzarim corridors.
Oh, really? Okay, I didn't. I thank you for clarifying.
Well, I also was like, Washington Post, that was a disingenuous way to report on this.
Well, I guess what I wanted to ask you is where do you? I mean, I know you don't necessarily have like an inside track to all of this, but I've been surprised by some of the people that Trump has given positions like Michael Domino at from Defense Priorities, uh, because it seems like there's a mix of realism and restraint people that he's bringing in, but also these sort of uh, hawkish figures as well that want the troops in the Middle East still. So,
Definitely.
what do you think is going on?
I mean, I think it's an internal conflict within sort of establishment Republican hawkish figures, the neocons, and this more sort of America First, JD Vance notion that so the Quincy Institute did an event with JD Vance and Vivek Ramaswamy. Before I had come back, I was, I think I forget even when this was, but essentially what was I believe JD said was, we'll let Israel can do whatever it wants, just not with our money, which in many ways means Israel can't do whatever it wants because it relies so heavily on American money and American weapons. So that's more sort of America first can't mean Israel first. My hope is that with some of these figures going into the administration, people like Elbridge Colby, for example, who will be in a senior position within the Pentagon, um, it's not many and it's not enough, and I wish that there were more figures committed to greater military restraint going into the Pentagon and the NSC and the State Department. But it's something. But I do think that there are likely to be battles over this between the hawks and those who say, no, America first means we're not fighting unnecessary wars and we're not going to fight a war with Iran on Israel's behalf. And we're not going to, Trump campaigning on resolving the war in Ukraine. I mean, uh, haven't seen much progress on that yet, but it remains to be seen.
Before we close out, what do you think? What should we be most concerned about right now for people following what's happening, not just in Gaza, but also the West Bank? I mean, where are the most important areas we should be looking at right now? What should we be keeping an eye on?
Um, I do think some of this sometimes Trump will say something to see how like what the reaction is. And so I think that if there is enough of a reaction that like no, aside from the moral question of ethnically cleansing Palestinians, it would be extremely destabilizing and against American interests and against Israeli security interests if that's your main focus. But people need to be saying that, to be calling the member of Congress, to be writing, op-eds to their local paper, to be trying to push back and to react. Because I do think that, in the aftermath of the ceasefire, we haven't seen as much focus on Gaza, not as, ongoing violence in the West Bank that just isn't necessarily getting the same kind of attention, in part because obviously Trump is creating so many of his own headlines and the media only has so much bandwidth. But, for people like you who are drawing attention to this, for just people on social media, just to make clear people still care about this issue. And when Trump throws around the idea of ethnically cleansing the Palestinians, people are going to react.
Well, I want to thank you again, Annelle Sheline, for coming on Parallax Views. And of course, my listeners can keep up with your work on X or Twitter or whatever it's called these days, and also at Responsible Statecraft and the Quincy Institute, right?
Yes, yeah. If people are interested, I have a brief at the Quincy Institute, and yeah, have written recently multiple articles for Responsible Statecraft, which is the sort of news arm of Quincy.
Thank you again.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.